Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, we're going to analyze a TOEFL reading passage and check whether you know all the strategies and techniques needed to tackle TOEFL reading. So if you find this section of the test difficult or can't get the score you need, keep watching. If you want to increase your score in a quick and effective way, click the link below to join our TOEFL course. Today's text is about Southwest agriculture. On test day, there will be 10 questions for each passage, but for this practice, we'll have 13 questions. That's because there are going to be a few more vocabulary questions than usual, which is a great addition for us. Let's dive in. The first question is the vocabulary question. It says, the word eventually in the passage is closest in meaning to. Then you need to choose which of the four options is the most similar in meaning. Eventually means in the end. So option C is the correct answer. This word is very common in TOEFL reading passages, and you'll come across it frequently. So in case you don't know it, make sure to write it down. Now, question 2 is the inference question. It says, paragraph 1 supports which of the following inferences about the North American Southwest? For inference questions, you need to read the paragraph and draw a conclusion based on it. In this question, I need to make an inference about the North American Southwest. Since the paragraph isn't very long, I would read it first. If the paragraph is longer, you can quickly skim the answer options before reading it. As I read, I try to break the text into a few short and easy to understand ideas. Pause the video now to try answering on your own first, then watch my explanation. I see that hunter-gatherers arrived, and after their arrival, several types of agriculture emerged. Emerged means appeared. Again, if you don't know this word, be sure to write it down. These types of agriculture addressed one main problem. The Southwest's fundamental problem. Fundamental means main. The problem was how to obtain enough water to grow crops. Why was it a problem? Because the environment isn't ideal for agriculture, as rainfall is low and unpredictable. As a result, little or no farming is practiced there today. Then, we see that people experimented with alternative strategies in different locations for a long time. And many of these experiments were successful for centuries. But eventually, all of them succumbed to environmental problems. What is the meaning of the word succumb? To succumb means to fail to resist pressure, to give in, or to be overwhelmed by a negative force. So basically, they all failed, except one. Let's look at the answer options. A. Its sources of water were plentiful when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. No, we just read that their main problem was how to obtain enough water to grow crops. B. It has always lacked the large population needed to perform successful experiments in agriculture. There is no mention of the population, so B is incorrect. C. Its climatic conditions today are essentially similar to those existing when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. Now, the paragraph says, all involving different solutions to the Southwest's fundamental problem. Fundamental problem, how to obtain enough water to grow crops in an environment where rainfall is so low and unpredictable that little or no farming is practiced there today. This shows that the climatic conditions now are similar to those when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. So C is the correct answer. Now D, it was more seriously affected by climate change than it was by human impact, is incorrect. There is no comparison made between climate change and human impact. The paragraph only mentions human impact or climate change at the end, but doesn't compare them. So C is the correct answer. If you start by reading the answer options, then read the text, then go back to the answer options, you'll waste a lot of time. Also, if you focus too much on the keywords, you might miss option C because it doesn't contain enough keywords from the text. So for this question, focus on the ideas, not the keywords. Now, question 3 is the negative factual information question. It's the one where you see the word except, which means you need to find the option that is not correct based on the text. The question says, all of the following are mentioned in paragraph 2 as potential problems faced by the Hohokam except. Now, for this question, I suggest you read the answer options first. A. Insufficient rainfall to allow crops to grow. B. Rainstorms leading to destructive water runoff. C. Insufficient workers to dig ditches and canals. And D. Irrigation water levels in channels too low to be used. So we have insufficient rainfall, rainstorms, insufficient workers, irrigation water levels that are too low. Now, with these options in mind, I go back to the text and look for the potential problems faced by the Hohokam. I can see that one strategy was to live at higher elevations, where rainfall was higher. But that carried a risk because higher elevations are cooler than lower elevations. And in an especially cool year, it might be too cold to grow crops at all. An opposite extreme was to farm at the warmer, low elevations. But there the rainfall is insufficient, even for dry land agriculture. The Hohokam got around that problem by constructing the most extreme irrigation system in the Americas outside Peru. But irrigation entailed the risk that human digging of ditches and canals could lead to sudden heavy water runoff from rainstorms, digging further down into the ditches and canals, and carving out deep channels. So in that case, the water level would drop below the field level, making irrigation impossible for people without pumps. Now let's check the answer choices. A. Insufficient rainfall to allow crops to grow. Mentioned in the middle of the paragraph. The text says, the rainfall is insufficient even for dry land agriculture. B. Rainstorms leading to destructive water runoff. Mentioned closer to the end of the paragraph. Irrigation entails the risk that human digging of ditches and canals could lead to sudden heavy water runoff from rainstorms, which means that rainstorms could lead to destructive water runoff. D. Irrigation water levels in channels too low to be used. Mentioned in the last sentence. The water level would drop below the field level, making irrigation impossible for people without pumps. But what about option C? Insufficient workers to dig ditches and canals. Now, this sentence contains many keywords from the paragraph, but it's actually incorrect, which makes it the correct answer. Why? We do have a mention of workers digging ditches and canals, but there is no indication that there were not enough of them. So C is the answer. Always remember that the correct answer is the one that is incorrect based on the text. Great job. The next question is another vocabulary question. It's about the word initially. We know that initially means at first. So A, first, is correct. Let's move on to question 5. It's one more vocabulary question. I love these practice tests because they provide more questions, especially more vocabulary questions, which is great for testing your vocabulary. By the way, in case you've been wondering, this test comes from the Wakeshoe website. If you prefer apps or find the Chinese on the Wakeshoe website a bit confusing, you can practice with the Lingua TOEFL app. There, you can select the question types that are most challenging for you and focus on them until you master them. Then move on to the practice tests. Now back to the question. The word adjacent in the passage is closest in meaning to neighboring, higher, unused, additional. An adjacent room is the room next door. So adjacent refers to something that is neighboring. That's why A is correct. If you don't know this word, be sure to write it down, because once again, it's very helpful for the TOEFL test. Also, feel free to check out these videos I've made with the most common vocabulary for the TOEFL test. Now, question number 6 is the factual information question. It asks us, according to paragraph 3, which of the following was the cause of the collapse of the member society? For this question, we need to find the key words, which are collapse and member society, and analyze what the question is asking. We need to identify the cause of the collapse. Then, we'll locate the right sentence or two in the paragraph based on the keywords we've identified. Some students might see the first mention of the member society, go straight to it and start reading. However, they will most likely need to read the whole text. And while there is nothing wrong with that, it will waste a lot of time. This means they'll probably end up running out of time by the end of the text. So remember, for this question type, the factual information question, you always want to find one or at most 2 sentences, no more than that. In this case, I see that the member society is mentioned 3 times. Once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once closer to the end of the paragraph. If I check the mention at the end, I see that it also includes the word collapse. In the question, we have the noun, collapse, and in the text, we have the verb, to collapse. So I'm going to read this sentence and give it a try. However, when drought conditions returned, that gamble left them with a population double what the floodplain could support, and the member society collapsed suddenly under the stress. This means that when the dry period returned, they could not support their population because it was too large. As a result, the society collapsed. Now, keeping this information in mind, I go back to the answer options. As I scan them, I see that D is the correct answer. Their population became too large to survive when the climate entered a dry period. That's it. You don't need to read the whole paragraph. As you can see, answering TOEFL reading questions isn't just about your English level. It's also largely about how well you know the strategies and how quickly you can apply and adjust them. This makes up about 60 or 70% of your success. Together with academic vocabulary and sufficient practice, that's all you need to know to score 30 out of 30. If you want to learn how to effectively apply all the strategies in the reading section and do so easily and effortlessly without wasting time, click on the link below and enroll in our TOEFL preparation course. We'll guide you through each strategy step by step, and we'll work through many reading passages together, where I'll show you exactly how to apply the strategies you've learned. In my one-on-one sessions, I've noticed that the majority of students know the strategies, but they struggle to adapt and apply them to the right questions, especially under time pressure. This is why it's so important not only to study the strategies, but also to practice them repeatedly to ensure you're applying them correctly. Doing so will save you a lot of time on test day and help you score 25 plus in the reading section. The link is below. Our next question is another factual information question. Again, the strategy is exactly the same. Read the question first, then locate the relevant part of the text. Read it and find the correct answer. The question says, according to paragraph 4, the solution of moving to other previously occupied areas was effective only when. So what we need to find in the text is when and only when the solution of moving to other previously occupied areas was effective. I go to the text and see the word solution mentioned right at the very beginning. The text says, still, another solution was to occupy an area only for a few decades. A decade is a period of 10 years, until the area's soil became exhausted, then to move to another area. But when was it effective? I keep reading and I see that method worked when people were living at low population densities, when there were many unoccupied areas to move to, and when each occupied area could be left unoccupied again for sufficiently long after occupation, so its vegetation and soil nutrients had time to recover. So basically, what they're saying here is that this method was effective when the population wasn't very dense. As a result, there were many unoccupied areas people could move to, and the previously occupied areas could be left empty for a while, allowing the vegetation and soil nutrients to recover. Keeping this information in mind, I go back to the answer options. As I read them, you can pause the video now to find the correct answer yourself first. I immediately see the B is correct. The vegetation and nutrients of the previously occupied area had time to recover. That's exactly what we read in the passage. For factual information questions, I always suggest reading the relevant part of the text first, so you can formulate the answer in your own words. That way, when you check the answer choices, finding the right one becomes a piece of cake. Let's move on to the next question. We have another negative factual information question. The solution for unpredictable rainfall described in paragraph 5 involved all of the following except. Let's read the answer options. Planting crops in many different places, regardless of predicted rainfall. Using a simple political and social system for the coordination of agricultural activities. Harvesting crops from those sites that did receive adequate rain. Sharing harvested crops with people whose crops did not grow well. To make these options easier to remember, let's simplify them. Planting crops in many places. Using a simple system to coordinate agricultural activities. Harvesting crops from places that got enough rain. And sharing crops with those who had bad harvests. You always want to simplify the answer choices so you don't forget them. Now let's look at the paragraph. As we read the text, we see that one more strategy was to plant crops at many sites even though rainfall was locally unpredictable. That matches option A, planting crops in many places. Eliminate it. And then to harvest crops at whichever sites did get enough rain to produce a good harvest. This matches option C, harvesting crops from places that got enough rain. Again, eliminate it. And to redistribute some of the harvest to the people still living at all the sites that did not happen to receive enough rain that year. This matches option D, sharing crops with those who had bad harvests. Eliminate it. So A, C, and D are all mentioned in the text. Now let's look at option B. B says, using a simple political and social system for the coordination of agricultural activities. But the text says, redistribution was not without risks because it involved a complex political and social system to integrate activities between different sites. The text says complex, while option B says simple. That's a contradiction, which means sentence B is incorrect, according to the passage. So the correct answer is B. Let's move on. Next is the vocabulary question. To depend on someone means to rely on someone. So C, Reliable is the right answer. Question 10. Which of the following contributed to the success of the strategy discussed in paragraph 6? Simply put, why did the strategy become effective? Let's start reading. The remaining strategy was to plant crops and live near permanent or dependable sources of water, but on landscape benches above the main floodways, so as to avoid the risk of a heavy flood washing out fields and villages, and to practice a diverse economy, exploiting ecologically diverse zones so that each settlement would be self-sufficient. That solution, adopted by people whose descendants live today in the Southwest's Hopi and Zuni villages, has succeeded for more than 1,000 years. So, the strategy succeeded. Why did it succeed? Because for one, they were planting crops and living near permanent or dependable sources of water. But at the same time, they were above the main floodways, so a heavy flood could not wash out their fields or villages. And one more reason they became successful was that they practiced a diverse economy. Now let's look at the answer options. Crops were planted high enough to avoid being carried away by floods. The text says, but on landscape benches above the main floodways, so as to avoid the risk of a heavy flood washing out fields and villages. So option A is the correct answer. You can also read the rest of the options to double check that none of them work for this paragraph. Question 11. Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage? This is a very good question because it asks us to look at the whole text and analyze how it is structured. To answer this question, you want to quickly skim through each paragraph and recall its main idea. It might seem challenging, but remember, you've already answered all the previous questions, so you have a solid understanding of the text. Besides, you don't need to read everything. Usually, just the beginning of each paragraph is enough. If you remember, the first paragraph was all about trying to find different strategies to solve the fundamental problem: how to obtain enough water to grow crops in an environment where rainfall was low. Let's look at how each of the following paragraphs begins. One strategy was, a more conservative strategy was, still another solution was, one more strategy was, the remaining strategy was. Basically, the text first describes a major problem, the lack of water for crops, and then lists several strategies to solve it. If we check the answer options, we can see the D, a description of a long-standing problem faced by the people in Southwest North America, followed by a discussion of strategies that have been used to overcome this problem, is the right answer. The next question is my favorite, the insert text question. This question is fairly easy, yet many students struggle with it because they use the wrong approach. What we need to do is look at the four squares and figure out where the given sentence can be added in the passage. The sentence is, another risk of irrigation was that floods could simply wash away the dams and channels, as indeed may have happened eventually to the Hohokam. The sentence mentions another risk of irrigation, which means that before we introduce it, we need to mention the first risk of irrigation. It also talks about floods. We don't have any pronouns to help us here, but the phrase another risk will allow us to find the right answer. Now, look at the sentence that begins with, but irrigation entailed the risk. It introduces the first risk, which, if you remember from earlier, was about the heavy water runoff. This means that our sentence should come after this one. It can either go in square C or square D. Let's check option C. It says, in that case, the water level would drop below the level of the field. This phrase refers to the first risk, so option C doesn't work either. That leaves us with option D. Here is the structure of the paragraph. First, We mentioned the opposite extreme. Then we explain how the Hohokam got around the problem. Then the first risk is introduced, the heavy water runoff. The text then explains what would happen in this case. Finally, we introduce one more risk. The flood could wash away the dams and channels. So D is the right answer. Finally, the last question is the summary question. Here you need to choose 3 sentences that summarize the main idea of the text. The introductory sentence is, people trying to grow crops in the dry southwestern area of North America experimented with various strategies for almost 1,000 years. Now we just need to choose 3 options that represent the main ideas of the paragraphs.
What's the easiest way to tackle this question? First, you can quickly skim through the reading passage again and identify the main ideas of each paragraph. Then, try to match those ideas with the answer choices. Remember, if an answer choice summarizes ideas from 2 or even 3 paragraphs, it's most likely correct. Another tip is to go through the options and eliminate those that are just supporting points or minor details. Also, never pick 2 options that refer to the same paragraph. Each correct answer should represent a particular part of the passage. Pause the video now and try to choose the correct answers. The correct answers are C, D, and F. Great job!
Well, that's the end of our reading test. Thanks for watching. Let me know how many questions you got right and which ones were the most challenging. If you want to work on your reading strategy, click on the link below and join our course. As always, I wish you all a stellar TOEFL score. Until next time, bye.